Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to be looking at British imperialism. As Mr. Guilford introduced to you yesterday, we were looking at our introduction to imperialism and what caused it and what it looked like. And so today we're going to be looking at kind of the most important of the imperial powers, Britain, although we're not going to go into too much detail because we'll be doing that in subsequent lessons. So our goals for the video, really, we want to see the causes of Great Britain's empire building and what regions Great Britain controlled. And we'll look specifically at Australia and New Zealand. And then what did British imperialism look like in its colonies and protectorates? And some vocabulary here, including those two words, colony and protectorate. So let's look first at the causes of British imperialism. Most of these should be familiar to you. So first of all, industrialization. Britain, of course, is a worldwide empire even by 1700. I mean, they control the American colonies. They control substantial areas of course, Canada and other places in the world. But they're also the first to industrialize. As we know, the Industrial Revolution begins in the late 1700s, the mid to late 1700s in Great Britain. And since we know that industrialization is one of the reasons that pushes European countries outward to get raw materials, Britain becomes the first. So they expand to other places to attain raw materials. And some examples of these materials might be ivory from Africa that would be brought back and made into things like piano keys, or cotton from India, which could be brought back and made into manufactured cloth. Also, things like clothing, dyes, tea, coffee, cocoa, all these sorts of things would come from other places in their empire. But it wasn't just about getting things or getting raw materials. Britain also wanted to sell their finished commercial products around the world. So, for example, African port cities imported a great deal of cloth. In fact, between 1820 and 1860, cotton cloth imports to Africa increased 950%. And so we see kind of a huge increase in the amount of trade. Also, in India began importing between 1840 and 1870, 350% more things. And they're exporting 400% more. Now, what do all these numbers mean? You don't have to remember them, but what they do show is that throughout these 1800s, especially into the latter part of the 1800s, we see an intense increase in the amount of goods traded as Britain continues to industrialize. And one of the things that helps this are technological changes. For example, new ship technology, such as the Clipper ship, which you see here, which was an extremely large and fast sailing ship. It cut sailing times in half around the world. This is an American Clipper ship here. You can see the American flag on the back, but Britain had these as well. Also, it could carry much more, whereas early ships could carry about 300 tons. Clipper ships could carry about 2,000 tons of goods. This will eventually be replaced by the steamship, so even greater technological changes by the time we get to 1900. So with the increase in shipping volume, this also lowers the cost of shipping for Britain and allows them to make even more money to put into industry, to grow and continue to expand. There are also cultural causes of this. Religion, especially spreading into Africa, racist pseudoscience that we've talked about, competition, all these things that Mr. Guilford talked about in the last video. But we can also look at political and strategic changes and advantages. So, for example, political changes that were going on in the world. In the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars take place, and with the defeat of the Dutch and the French, the British are able to expand their control into places like Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, and the Caribbean, places that had been Dutch colonies or French colonies. And this political change kind of puts Britain kind of in the forefront. As we know, throughout the 1800s, Britain does not have the same type of political turmoil, so they can concentrate on expanding overseas. Now, there are also some strategic advantages that Britain was looking for. For example, taking over the Cape Colonies you see here on the southern tip of Africa allowed Britain to have a very strategic outpost for supplies and trade. Other places in Southeast Asia were very important for this as well, in the Caribbean as well. So all these things kind of come together to cause Britain to continue to expand more and more. So that brings us to this question: where was the British Empire? And you might just say, where wasn't the British Empire as well? You can see on this map, if you follow my mouse, see where it is? It's stretched from Canada to South America, to different regions of Africa. You need to look at if you look at your map that you colored, you can see the names of these places: South Africa, Sudan, Egypt, Nigeria, British Somaliland, even into the Middle East in places like Yemen and Kuwait, into India and Burma, and into the Malay Peninsula, and into Indonesia, and especially Australia and New Zealand. But it was truly a worldwide empire. No longer was it just an Atlantic empire or a European empire. Britain stretched around the world. It was basically the largest empire from end to end in world history. It's up there kind of with the Mongols' land empire. So what did British rule look like? Well, it kind of looked like other imperial rules. A lot of people modeled themselves after Great Britain. So we see either colonies or protectorates, and these places can be run with direct rule or indirect rule. So here are the common things that we'll see. So a colony is an area under the full political control of another country. So Britain had colonies around the world, and the American colonies were a part of this in the 1700s. But as we get into the 1800s, a good example are places like Burma or Nigeria. And there were two types of rules, or ways to rule. And this could be direct rule, meaning the British had complete control of the colony and the government of the colony, or indirect rule, meaning local rulers could impose the will of the British. In places like Burma, the British kicked out the Burmese monarchy and installed its own government. Indirect rule existed in places like Nigeria, where Britain left in local leaders, just in exchange for their cooperation. In some places, it would change over time. So you might have indirect rule, but after a rebellion or some type of uprising, they might come and have a more direct rule over the colony. It could go the other way too, as we'll see kind of in places like Canada and Australia. The other type of rule is a protectorate. Basically, you leave the local rulers in place, but they're advised by officials from your country. And this was something Britain liked to do. For example, in India, they were a protectorate for a time. Local Indian leaders were in charge, but the British advised them, obviously in ways that would help Britain. And at different times, they had different protectorates. Egypt was a protectorate of England for a time as well. Oftentimes, the military might be present in this as well. So let's take a look specifically at a place that we'll only cover really right here. As we go into later lessons, we'll be looking at Southeast Asia and China and Japan and Africa much more closely. But in many places, Britain leaves the indigenous population, meaning the native population, in place. For example, in India, the native Indians are left in place. They trade with them. The British rule over them, but they don't displace them or get rid of them or force them to move in favor of British settlers. But in Australia and New Zealand, that's going to be very different. So they kind of take this other model, which is displacing the indigenous populations. So Australia had been sighted actually back in the 1600s by the Portuguese, although there were native peoples there. And the British began really exploring it in the 1700s. As new diseases are introduced to Australia and New Zealand, these kind of people who have been separated from many other peoples for a long time, their populations severely decrease. And we call the native peoples of Australia the Aborigines, and the natives in New Zealand are the Maori. So as these numbers begin to decrease, it makes it easier for Great Britain to settle those regions, Australia and New Zealand. Britain begins to use Australia really as a colony for convicts, and they begin to send people, including there was one famous convict who broke into the palace and stole the underwear of Queen Victoria, and he was convicted and sent to Australia to the penal colony there to serve his time. And so it actually became just a convict colony. But after the discovery of gold in Australia in 1851, a flood of free European settlers moved to that colony. In New Zealand, British settlers come much more slowly, but once the Maori tribes are defeated there, faster ships and a gold rush there brings many more British immigrants to the region. Ultimately, as more and more British settlers come to Australia and New Zealand, it ceases to be kind of an area that they have to worry about uprisings in. So gradually power is turned over to these places. And Britain still maintains control and a lot of trade with these regions, and they get a lot of resources from these regions. But ultimately, as we know, they'll become independent nations. All right, that's about it for today's video. We looked at a good specific example there, but just make sure you can get the causes of the empire building, know where Britain gained control, take a look at your maps again that you created in class. That would be a very good thing to do to find out where Great Britain was. And, of course, what did it look like in these colonies and protectorates, and Australia and New Zealand specifically. That's it. Have a good day.